let me know if that works, Lisa. I can also jot them down really quick and just share them. Oh, wonderful, thank you. All right, so welcome again to today's webinar, Systems Thinking in Public Health. I'm glad you could join us today. We'll be covering today both the philosophy and the tools or nuts and bolts of systems thinking. Specifically, we'll cover an introduction to systems thinking. We'll look at a published example of systems thinking applied in public health and go in depth with that example. We'll share one of our own case studies applying systems thinking to food security, and we'll share some tips for understanding systems thinking and applying systems thinking perspectives and tools. So if this is your first webinar with us, we welcome you. We're excited you joined us. We offer free webinars every month as a service to those working to address health and social problems. And this may be your first webinar or your first introduction to Equiate. We're a consulting firm based in Alberta, Canada. Our focus is on solving social problems with a particular focus on the health or social gradient. And my name is Steve Peterson. I'm the founder and managing partner of Equiate, and I'll be your webinar host this morning. I'd like to mention at the beginning, today's webinar is being recorded and will be made available on our website as soon as possible, usually within a day or two, so that way you can watch and learn without feeling you need to feverishly take notes, because it will be available shortly. So let's take a minute just to orient you to your webinar interface. We went over the phone information. You can also see at the top a My Mood icon. When we get to the question and answer section at the conclusion of the webinar, we'll be using this My Mood option. If you hover your mouse over it, it'll give you some options: yes, no, raising your hand, I'm fine. So for asking questions, if you raise your hand, try that. Just click on raise hand. You'll see beside your name in the screen that a hand icon appears. There you go. You can see it on the screen there. So when we get to the Q&A section, if you have a question, raise your hand. And if you're on the phone, you can ask it on the phone. Or if you're on the computer, you can type it in the chat window, and we'll go through them that way. So why a webinar on systems thinking? I want to start by saying I'm not an expert in systems thinking by any means. I've been exploring it the past 2 years as a way of thinking about the world and of working with causes and root causes to improve health in society. And I found it to be amazing. It's both challenging and exhilarating at the same time. And as I study it and read and learn new things, I'm always enchanted and challenged at the same time. I'm enchanted with the possibilities and challenged by how deep this field is and how much I don't know about it, even though I've been studying it for 2 years. So I hope to be able to pass along some of the enchantment it has captured me with to you today in this webinar. So I'd like to begin today's webinar with 2 stories or examples. Let's first consider rain and the water cycle. Now we might remember learning about this in science class in school. We understand evaporation, condensation, rainfall, rain collecting, flowing back to the ocean where it evaporates and the process repeats. This cycle represents a system of relationships and interactions. As Peter Senge described, and we'll come back to him, you can only understand the system of a rainstorm by contemplating the whole, not any individual part of the pattern. But so well accepted that this is a cycle that it would be impossible to explain rainfall by focusing on any of the cycle's component parts. So we look at rainfall as a system. Another example is a well-known anecdote about the difference between an Aboriginal and Western scientist and how they might approach the study of a plant. Rupert Ross described this, and I'll quote him, quote, "The Western scientist might focus most of their attention on understanding and naming all the parts and properties of the plant, figuring out its root, stem, and leaf patterns, how it takes in water, sunlight, and nutrients, how it reproduces, its life expectancy, and so forth. The Aboriginal scientists, by contrast, would likely focus most of their attention on understanding what role that plant plays in the meadow. She would examine how it holds soil when the rain comes, what plants flourish close to it, what birds, animals, and insects are attracted to it, how it is useful to them, what kinds of conditions it needs to remain healthy, that sort of thing. It's not that the two scientists pay no attention to the concerns of the other, just that their emphasis is different. They see the plant in different ways. End of quote. The one perspective focuses on isolating the properties of the plant. The other focuses on the relationship of the plant in its environment and its effect. As the quote described, neither is wrong, they're just different. And this difference is at the core of systems thinking. As described by Peter Senge again, the essence of the discipline of systems thinking lies in a shift of mind, seeing relationships rather than linear cause and effect chains, and seeing processes of change rather than snapshots. So why would public health be interested in systems thinking? Well, there's a few reasons. You may remember the documentary Unnatural Causes. Wonderful. Well done. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. Our library has a copy in Lethbridge, so I'm sure it's available. Somebody you know somewhere has a copy if you wish to see it. In the documentary, they interviewed Nancy Krieger, who's a social epidemiologist at Harvard University, and this is the quote she said. She said, "There's one view of us as biological creatures. We are determined by our genes, that what we see in our biology is innately us, because who we were born to be. What that misses is that we grow up and develop. We grow up as children, we grow up as adults and continue. We interact constantly with the world in which we are engaged. That's the way in which the biology actually happens. We carry our history in our bodies. How else? How can we not?" End of quote. So Dr. Krieger mentions that we grow and develop, interacting constantly with the world around us. These interactions and changes she alludes to are characteristics of systems thinking. Another example, this is a quote from Naldenberg et al. "Symptoms of ill health are the result of different processes leading toward this state of ill health. It is understood that these processes are influenced by physical, social, mental, and ecological factors. These influences do not occur one at a time, but continuously change and affect each other, creating a complex network of interaction and communication. Systems thinking is about incorporating the whole of a system and the relationship between the parts instead of isolating the parts that make up this whole. The context, circumstances, and environment of a system play an important role in systems thinking. This rationale of systems thinking fits nicely with the notion that effective health promotion needs to do justice to the complexity of health, and that it has to address many actors and factors on multiple levels at the same time." End of quote. So what Naldenberg is referring to is the complexity of the world we live in. The continual changes and networks of interaction and communication he mentioned as being important. I think while we acknowledge this in public health, and we do our best to understand it, we don't do a really good job of working with it. Or described by Green in one of his papers, quote, "We seek a more evidence-based public health practice, but too much of our evidence comes from artificially controlled research that does not fit the realities of practice. The challenge is that most of the evidence is not very practice-based. The evidence given greatest credence, and therefore the most play in evidence-based guidelines, comes from highly controlled trials, ideally controlled by random assignment, but in fact made more artificial or unrepresentative by whatever methods of control are used. These methods are ineffective for taking into consideration the large number of variables, the great variability within them, and the diverse circumstances of public health practice. Indeed, they seek to take these variables out of consideration by controlling them, equalizing them, or holding them constant rather than variable. Systems thinking and modeling seems to offer, among other things, an alternative to the controlled trial with simulation, rather than control as the major source of evidence. It treats the multiplicity of variables as a resource to be used for deeper analysis, rather than as a nemesis to be controlled." End of quote. Or in simpler terms, that was a long quote, a simpler explanation comes from a traditional Sufi story that goes like this. You think that because you understand one, that you must therefore understand two, because one and one make two. But you forget that you must also understand and in the equation 1 and 1 make 2. So if we could summarize these lengthy quotes and kind of these ideas all together, public health and epidemiology is highly effective at looking at causal relationships between variables, but it does so by isolating them, by controlling for everything that can be controlled for and looking at how does A influence B. But that's not the way the world works. So systems thinking presents itself as a method for working with the complexity of the real world, as opposed to its component parts and their linear relationships. So let's dive right in and give an introduction into systems thinking and how it works. First, some philosophy. Systems thinking, as the name suggests, is a way of thinking. Peter Senge is an MIT professor and one of the leading thinkers in the field. I'd like to share a few of his quotes from his book, The Fifth Discipline, that illustrate the philosophy of systems thinking. First, quote, from a very early age we are taught to break apart problems, to fragment the world. This apparently makes tasks and subjects more manageable, but we pay a hidden, enormous price. We can no longer see the consequences of our actions. We lose our intrinsic sense of connection to a larger whole. When we then try to see the big picture, we try to reassemble the fragments in our minds to list and organize all the pieces. But as physicist David Bohm says, the task is futile, similar to trying to reassemble the fragments of a broken mirror to see a true reflection. Thus, after a while, we give up trying to see the whole altogether. End of quote. What I appreciate about this quote is the emphasis on a different approach than fragmenting and isolating problems, the components of problems, in order to understand them. Systems thinking is a way of seeing a whole, which really exists, rather than isolating components to try and make a whole. Another quote from Peter Senge. Most of the problems faced by humankind concerned our inability to grasp and manage the increasingly complex systems of our world. The causes of many pressing public issues, from urban decay to global ecological threat, lay in the very well-intentioned policies designed to alleviate them. These problems were actually systems that lured policymakers into interventions that focused on obvious symptoms, not underlying causes, which produced short-term benefit but long-term malaise, and fostered the need for still more symptomatic interventions. So this quote is really a shot across the bow for us in public health and others. He's saying most of our problems are caused by our inability to grasp and manage the systems of our world. So he introduces in this quote the idea of root causes and systems thinking as a way of avoiding chasing expressions of symptoms, which allows problems to continue or worsen. Another quote from Peter Senge. The unhealthiness of our world today is in direct proportion to our inability to see it as a whole. Or, as I understand it, if we keep treating symptoms, we will experience what Robert Evans described in the introduction to the classic text, Why Are Some People Healthy and Others Not?, where he said, quote, we may well have left undone those things that we ought to have done, and have done those things that we ought not to have done, and there will in consequence be less help in us than there could be. And in a similar vein, one more quote from Peter Senge. The long-term, most insidious consequence of applying non-systemic solutions is increased need for more and more of the solution. This is why ill-conceived government interventions are not just ineffective, they are addictive, in the sense of fostering increased dependency and lessened abilities of local people to solve their own problems. The phenomenon of short-term improvements leading to long-term dependency is so common, it has its own name among system thinkers. It's called shifting the burden of the intervener. End of quote. So you can imagine the very first time I was reading Peter Senge, almost the whole book's underlined. It was one of those type of experience. Each of these quotes and many others, it was like, wow. And just thinking about what he's saying and trying to connect it to public health and to the way we work with and see the issues that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. So that's some of the philosophy of systems thinking. Let's shift thinking to the nuts and bolts of systems thinking to get a better understanding of how it works. So the nuts and bolts of systems thinking include, you'll hear these words thrown about all the time, and we'll discuss each of them. Elements, interconnections, functions or purposes, stocks, flows, and feedback loops. Now, there's a lot more to each of these than we'll be able to cover in today's webinar, but we'll introduce each of them. But first, let's talk about a system and what a system is. Let's define system. So Donella Meadows, she was also from MIT. It's kind of the birthplace of a lot of systems thinking. She defines a system as a set of things, people, cells, molecules, or whatever, interconnected in such a way that they produce their own pattern of behavior over time. Now the system may be buffeted, constricted, triggered, or driven by outside forces, but the system's response to these forces is characteristic of itself, and that response is seldom simple in the real world. End of quote. So it's a set of things that are interconnected in a way that they produce their own pattern of behavior over time. She adds to that definition by saying, a system is an interconnected set of elements that is coherently organized in a way that achieves something. Now if you look at that definition closely for a moment, you can see that a system, she identifies three things: elements, interconnections, and a function or purpose. Now of these three things, it's the easiest to define system elements. If we look at a system, for example an economy, we start to list what component parts are there in an economy. You can almost go on for as much time as you have. You list component parts, you can break them down into smaller parts and smaller parts and smaller parts. These are the system elements, the things that you can see and measure and count. And in health, an analogy might be the determinants of health. These are the things that we can see around us that influence health. Now interconnections, these are the relationships that hold the elements together. They're the flows of information that allow one part of a system to respond to what is happening somewhere else in a system. If we took an example, a university, and how a university works, the interconnections for all the system elements in the university system would include things like admission standards, degree requirements, exams, grades, budgets. These are all factors that determine how and when and where the elements of the system are applied. Now a system purpose or function is perhaps the hardest to identify, because it's not necessarily what's written or spoken or expressed explicitly. The way to deduce a system's purpose is to watch how a system behaves. Purposes are deduced from behavior, not from stated goals or rhetoric. So for example, again, an economy. What is the purpose of an economy? Depending on your perspective and who you are, the stated purpose might be very different from the observed purpose, what you actually see happening from your perspective or in the population you're paying attention to. Now we can understand the relative importance of a system's elements, interconnections, and purposes by imagining them changed one by one. Changing elements usually has the least effect on the system. For example, in an orchestra is a system. If you change all the elements or all the members of an orchestra, it's still an orchestra. It may play better or worse depending on, the quality of the people you shift in and out. So the elements in the system are important, but the functioning of the system can change the least by focusing on its elements. Now, this should give us in public health pause. For as we focus on society as a system, society and health, and many of its subsystems, again, we look often at the elements that comprise those systems, such as determinants of health and others. But what systems thinking suggests is this may be the least effective way of improving health. It's almost a dangerous thought. It's one worth thinking about. But back to comparing changes. So system elements, if we change them, the system more or less stays the same. If interconnections change, the system may be greatly altered. It may be even unrecognizable, even though the same players are on the team. One example of interconnections can be rules. So if we have a game of football and we change its rules to those of basketball, we've completely changed the experience. We've created a whole new ball game. Those interconnections can be a profound change tool. Now, change in purpose also changes the system profoundly, even if every element and interconnection remains the same. Let's go back to our example of an economy. And remember that it's not the stated purpose, but the observable purpose based on behavior that is the actual purpose. Now, economies are judged to be sound when its overall production is growing, and an economy is judged to be struggling when its production is shrinking. So its purpose, based on this, is to grow. Now, considerations about where that growth is focused, or who benefits from it, or whether even growth is the best outcome are talked about, but they're not as observable in an economy's behavior than simply growth or lack thereof. So it comes back to also how it's measured. What do we measure? If our indicator for an economy's well-being is its growth, that's what we're identifying as its purpose. That's what we're paying attention to. Now, another example would be an education system. You may be familiar with Ken Robinson. He gave a wonderful TED Talk a few years ago on education and creativity. I'd like to quote from his talk. This is what he said, quote, "If you were to visit education as an alien and say, 'What's it for, public education?' I think you'd have to conclude, if you look at the output, who really succeeds? Who does everything that they should? Who gets all the brownie points? Who are the winners? I think you'd have to conclude the whole purpose of public education throughout the world is to produce university professors." Now, our education system is predicated on the idea of academic ability, and there's a reason. The whole system was invented. Around the world, there were no public systems of education really before the 19th century. They all came into being to meet the needs of industrialism. So the hierarchy in education is rooted on two ideas. Number one, that the most useful subjects for work are at the top, math and science. So you were probably steered benignly away from things at school when you were a kid, things you liked on the grounds that you would never get a job doing that. Is that right? Don't do music, you're not going to be a musician. Don't do art, you won't be an artist. Benign advice, now profoundly mistaken. The whole world is engulfed in a revolution. And the second is academic ability, which has really come to dominate our view of intelligence, because the universities designed the system in their image. If you think of it, the whole system of public education around the world is a protracted process of university entrance. And the consequence is that many highly talented, brilliant, creative people think they're not, because the thing they were good at school wasn't valued, or was actually stigmatized. And I think we can't afford to go on that way. End of quote. So his commentary on the purpose of education as a system raises many interesting points that suggest that the education system's purpose is fostering a particular type of education, with the result that some people don't get the education they could because their talents or interests weren't valued. So again, the purpose of a system is profoundly important, and it's not the stated purpose, it's the observable purpose. It's what you see in the system's behavior. Just to review what we've just covered, there are three main components in the nuts and bolts of a system: elements, interconnections, and function or purpose. Now, systems also have memory. They operate over time. When we start to look at that, that's where we observe patterns of behavior. And this is key, this is important. And this introduces us to three more ideas, important building blocks of systems: stocks, flows, and feedback loops. Now, stocks are the elements of the system. These are the things that you can count, measure, and are the foundation of any system. This is a system diagram, and the stock is in the middle. You can see it in a box. So it's something that exists. Now, stocks change over time through the actions of flows. You can see an inflow and an outflow from this box. So flows could be births and deaths. It could be growth and decay. It could be success and failure. It's any combination of input or output. So stocks do change, but only over time, as flows take time to flow. Well, that's an important point. It's key to understanding system behavior. Stocks usually change very slowly, especially large stocks respond to change, even sudden change, only by gradual filling or emptying. So a feedback loop, that's the third piece. You can see that blue arrow from stock back to inflow. It's formed when changes in a stock affect the flows into or out of that same stock. A common example used is a bank account. The greater balance in your bank account, the more interest you earn on it. There's a feedback loop there from bank balance to interest earned. And you can see as your balance grows, so does the interest earned on that balance. It goes round and round and round. Another example, I thought relevant for Thursday morning in the summertime, caffeine. You may have had some caffeine this morning. You can see someone's modeled caffeine in the body as a stock, and consumption and disposal as the inflows and outflows. And the feedback loops, one of them focuses on drowsiness. You see just below the stock caffeine in the body. So depending on the level of drowsiness, the caffeine consumption would increase or decrease. And there's other effects you can see noted in this diagram. That's the basic idea of stocks, flows, and feedback loops. Now with feedback loops, there are two main types. It's called a balancing feedback loop and a reinforcing feedback loop. Now a balancing feedback loop, it works to stabilize the stock level and keep it within an acceptable range. They're often described as being goal-seeking or stability-seeking. So balancing feedback loop, it opposes whatever direction of change a system is experiencing. So our bodies have many balancing feedback loops. If you eat too much sugar, or if you eat or drink too much of something, your body seeks to counter that in various ways to keep your body levels within an acceptable range. Now a reinforcing feedback loop works differently. It enhances whatever direction of change is imposed. So this is where it creates a cycle or circle that in a good sense can cause growth, or if it's a bad cycle, can ultimately cause harm, even destruction. So reinforcing loops are found wherever a system element has the ability to reproduce itself or to grow. And these characteristics are found in populations and economies, again, things that we're focused on in public health. So two types of feedback loops: balancing, trying to keep within a range, and reinforcing, amplifying. Whatever change process is happening, it picks it up and creates more of it. Now, an important point about feedback loops. The information delivered by a feedback loop can only affect future system behavior. It can't deliver a signal fast enough to correct the behavior that created the current feedback. Now, why is this important? Because it means there will always be delays in responding. Delays are another concept important to systems thinking. It says that a flow can't react instantly to a flow. It can only react to a change in the stock, and only after a slight delay to register the incoming information. And we're familiar with delays in public health. If you think to examples such as early childhood development, or even just generally prevention, where we talk about investments and then return on the investment years into the future. But the years into the future piece, that represents a delay in the change in stock based on an inflow. So we reviewed some of the philosophy and the nuts and bolts of systems thinking, and we're just sailing through this. We could spend years and years and years studying this, and people do. But we're just doing an introduction today. So let's switch gears and look at how has systems thinking been applied in public health. I'd like to review an example in some depth from the literature. And the literature on this area, I guess you could describe it as it's not large, but it's growing, and it reflects the growing interest in this subject. So the example I'd like to review is a January 2013 publication in the journal Health Promotion Practice. And the article is From Model to Action, using a system dynamics model of chronic disease risks to align community action. Now this article was awarded, incidentally, the 2013 Paper of the Year award by this journal. So it's an important article, an influential article. I'm a little curious how you award the 2013 Paper of the Year award only partway through 2013, but that's a different discussion. I'll have to ask them how that works. Nonetheless, it's a good paper. So This paper focuses on a county in Texas, East Travis County. They're looking to apply systems thinking and modeling to understand three things. One, how local conditions affect multiple risk factors for chronic disease. Two, how those risks affect population health status and costs over time. And three, how local health leaders could align their efforts to address these risk factors and lower the burden of cardiovascular disease in their county, given the constraint of limited resources. So applying systems thinking and systems modeling, it involves mapping causal factors, stocks, flows, feedback loops. The way they do this is you go to the literature. Everything in your map will be supported by the literature. So for them, they looked at meta-analysis, published studies, they talked to experienced practitioners to quantify causal factors in their model and how they influence one another. This is the model they came up with. Now if we look at this, it's almost overwhelming. There's a lot here. If you look at the bottom right portion of this model, here are the endpoints for the system. First time cardiovascular events and deaths, as well as costs from cardiovascular and other risk factor complications and from utilization of services. So this is what they're trying to focus on as the whole, what influences these things. So you can see they have three boxes there: obesity, smoking, and high blood pressure, high cholesterol, diabetes. And you can see all the arrows that connect these system elements. Smoking is connected to secondhand smoke, and on and on and on. You can go around the diagram and see this. Now you notice on the very outside there's a number of things in italics. Now they identified these outside factors. They call them local contextual factors, and these are their points of influence on the system. They describe the system inside, stress, diet, physical activity, its effects on obesity, obesity's effects on blood pressure, smoking, what affects smoking, smoking's effects on cardiovascular disease and on blood pressure, and they looked at what are all the local contextual influences on the systems map. Those are the things in italics on the outside. Now each of those is a lever that can be adjusted to affect the various health and economic outcomes over time. And in their simulations, they can move one or more of these levers, exploring a range of what-if questions in their search for promising strategies to pursue in the real world. Now in their model, they track changes along an intervention pathway, each intervention pathway, over a period of 35 years. So for each scenario tested, they'd test each lever. They would display the results over time and their impact on disease and on cost. I'll show you the results in a minute, but just one more thing they did. They bundled their interventions into three clusters. They referred to them as their care scenario, their air scenario, and their lifestyle scenario. Now their care scenario focused on access to primary care, the quality of primary care, and the marketing of primary care. And there were targets that they would identify from the literature, the ranges they could use in their modeling. The air scenario looked at tobacco tax and sales restrictions, smoking bans at work and public places, anti-smoking social marketing, and air pollution reductions as the interventions. And again, the ranges of what they could see through these interventions based on what they found in the literature as inputs into their modeling and simulations. And third, lifestyle scenarios: access to healthy food, social marketing for healthy food, access to physical activity options, social marketing for physical activity, junk food tax, sales restrictions, and reductions in sources of stress. And again, same thing. They look in the literature, see what are the ranges we can expect to see with these interventions, and they would use those as inputs to quantify their model and allow it to run through simulations. Now when they ran their simulations, they graphed the results across time. These are the graphs they created. Let's walk through each of these graphs to understand what the simulations taught them. So first, the care scenario at the top. If you remember, the care scenario was the primary care interventions. So enhanced primary care interventions provided, you can see, a quick, and a sustained reduction in cardiovascular events and deaths. That's the first graph on the left. The base case in each of these is baseline, what happens without any intervention. So when they implemented the care interventions, there was an immediate impact, and that impact was sustained over time. That's good. But there was very little in cost savings. You can see from the graph right beside that, looking at baseline cost and then the cost per capita of complication and management of cardiovascular disease once these interventions are implemented. There's a brief cost saving, and then the cost saving disappears over time. They quantified it as $35 per capita per year over 30 years. So not a huge cost savings. The second bundle, the air bundle, you can see what happened when they implemented this intervention. There was a quick and a growing reduction in cardiovascular events. The line starts off small and it gets wider as time progresses. In the cost graph, you can see quite an impact. A large cost savings, they quantified it at $355 per capita per year over 30 years, much larger than the $35 in the care interventions. Now that was as a bundle. When they looked at individual interventions, smoking, the social marketing of smoking to promote smoking prevention and cessation, as well as tobacco taxes and sales regulations, had the greatest effect on reducing cardiovascular events and costs. So they could drill down and isolate specific interventions within these bundles and see their impact as well. Now something unexpected in the air intervention bundle. A very unexpected result for many users of the model was the immediate impact that air quality had on cardiovascular death rates and costs, even in an area such as Austin, Texas, where this county is, that has relatively clean air. So it focused their attention on something unexpected by running this model as well. And the lifestyle bundle, the last bundle, you can see on the left, it reduced cardiovascular disease gradually over time. Although it had little effect in the short term, on the cost side, it produced increasing cost savings over time. That graph gets wider. They quantified them at $177 per capita per year over the 30 years. So not quite as good as the $355 in the air bundle, but much better than the $35 in the CARES bundle. So these interventions are a good long-term health investment for a community because their cost benefit continues to grow over time, the lifestyle interventions. So they tested the modeling of these interventions with a group of community stakeholders who rated their belief in the intervention effectiveness prior to seeing the modeling results and again after seeing the modeling results. And you can see in this graph, each intervention is rated on its percent change in participant perception. Would this be effective or not? You can see anti-smoking social marketing. That's the highest graph for positive change. The modeling showed this was effective, and it profoundly changed people's perception of it as an intervention strategy. Access to healthy food options and air pollution reduction also had enormous increases in support from the modeling exercises. On the flip side, marketing and mental health services lost support, as did access to weight loss services and reductions in sources of stress. Those three had the greatest decrease in support after the modeling simulation results were generated. This is interesting. This goes back to people's perceptions of what might work. And personally, I would have thought the stress intervention might have been effective and useful versus what the modeling shows them over time. And the modeling, again, is based on what's found in the literature. You go into the literature, what do people see as impacts from interventions? Hopefully there's meta-analysis that can help you do this. And you quantify that in your model, run your simulations, and see what kind of projected outputs you can expect over time into the future. Now this group of stakeholders in Texas, they were asked to identify at least one area that they could all agree they could immediately influence. The two they selected were a tobacco quit line and walking programs, so something they could immediately act on. The barriers of intervening weren't there. They could immediately jump in and get busy doing that. Now for this group, in this study, the model, combined with their local expertise, proved to be quite a valuable tool to re-examine their priorities, to justify the merits of possible strategies or policies, to obtain community buy-in, and to determine the best use of their limited resources. Now, remember we talked about air quality. This wasn't something they were considering, but seeing its impact on cardiovascular disease in these models, they saw the need to engage new partners in that sector, in their health work. So modeling was a very effective tool for them in helping to plan at a county level what they should do and who should be involved in their efforts. Let's move on from that published example, and I'd like to show you some of the work we're doing with systems thinking. And we've been applying it on the topic of food security. Now we know poor nutrition is a risk factor for obesity, overweight, and diabetes. There's a lot more, but we'll just focus on those. And those conditions are of particular concern among First Nations populations. Now, food security, if you're not familiar with the term, food security, food insecurity exists whenever the availability of nutritionally adequate and safe foods, or the ability to acquire acceptable foods in socially acceptable ways, is limited or uncertain. So when availability and access to food is compromised, the quality of diet decreases and the risk of disease increases. We can understand that. In a First Nations context, or an Aboriginal context, the prevalence of food insecurity is 54.2% for those living on reserve in Canada, compared to 8.8% for non-Aboriginals living off reserve. So it's a major issue affecting their health. So in applying a systems thinking perspective, we're trying to find an answer to the question, how can we most effectively intervene to improve food security in on-reserve communities? Now, if we remember systems, one of their characteristics is they have a memory. So in seeking to answer this question, we looked at this from a historical perspective up to the present day. This is what it looks like. The First Nations, previous to European settlement, generally lived in balance with the land as their source of food and sustenance, both directly through plant food sources and indirectly as the land supported buffalo and other game, which formed a staple part of their diet. In this relationship, the people prospered as the land prospered and suffered as the land suffered. So you can see food supply in the middle being affected by growing of food, the hunting of food, the market or trade of food, all of which are affected by land/ecology, so how well the land is doing. And the food supply is in a feedback loop with food security. So the one affects the other, and food security affects diets. You can just kind of follow this diagram through and see how these things are interconnected. Now, when settlers came and treaties were signed, this relationship was changed. The balance of the system was thrown off. Historically dependable food sources, the growing and the hunting and the marketing and trading, you can't really see in this diagram, but the solid lines are replaced with dotted lines. These decreased. Over time, they became almost historical artifacts, and they were no longer sustaining as a source of food. Replacing them were government programs and market sources of food, stores, other sources. You can see those feeding into the food supply. Now, the thing about these programs and sources is they were often inadequate, and in being inadequate, harmful to health. And over time, food security continues to be a challenge, as evidenced by the statistics cited earlier. The present-day food security, if we look at this diagram a bit differently, determinants of food security are often listed as things such as income, the rural remoteness of a community, which ties into access issues such as transportation, how easy is it to get food into a community through a supply chain, education, employment, culture. And you can see in this diagram how these things interrelate with each other and also affect market sources and the access, availability, and quality of the food supply. It starts to get a bit more complicated, but also a bit more helpful in saying, how can we most effectively intervene to improve food security? But our diagram's not done yet, because at the root of all these influences or determinants is how they affect the control First Nations have over their food supply. If we ask income, if we focus on income, why is income important? Well, income's important because it affects how much control people have over the food they eat. And the same plays for each of those factors. Why is transportation important? Well, if I'm able to travel to a place where I can buy healthy food, I have control over my diet. Or if healthy food is able to travel to my community at affordable rates, then I can afford the healthy food that's available in my community. Now, the level of control that First Nations people have was greatly affected by colonialism, including residential schools. And you could see the effect of colonialism on control in the diagram, and also there's an arrow tying over to government programs. Some programs still create dependency rather than capacity in how they work. So how does the systems map help us? Two ways. First, we can visualize the relationships and the causal factors. It allows us to place any intended intervention within the system map to see what the expected impact could be and if it's what we hope for. For example, gardening is a frequently emphasized food security strategy. Community gardens, home gardens, what can we do to help people grow their own food and experience a healthier diet that way? So how does gardening fit in? And the answer is it depends. It depends on how the gardening is done. It could be done in a way that does nothing but create temporary dependency on a government program. We'll come in and we'll rototill and we'll help you plant and harvest, and then when the program ends, no capacity has been created, but some food has been created. Alternatively, gardening can be done differently. It could be designed to increase individual and community control over their food supply in a way that builds capacity and ensures sustainability in that community. Now, a second way this map could help us is if we built it as a simulation. This one isn't. This one's just a concept map. If we built it as a simulation based on what we found in the literature about the impacts, the quantifiable impacts of interventions, it would allow us to explore possible outcomes over time from different interventions. The systems thinking applied in this map helps us to identify which interventions can have the most impact and how interventions relate to the various causal factors that affect diet and health. So we've covered a lot today. There's a lot in this topic. There's a lot we could focus on further. But today was meant just to give you an overview, an introduction to some of the ideas, principles, and application of those principles in systems thinking. Given what we've discussed, I'd like to conclude with 10 quick tips that you can use as you explore the potential of systems thinking in your own work. First, we live in a complex world, and the complexity of it often overwhelms us and creates a sentiment of, it's too hard, there's nothing I can do to change something. Systems thinking is the antidote to this sense of helplessness that many people feel. It's the discipline for seeing structures that underlie complexity and for discerning high from low leverage change possibilities. That's the first tip. An antidote to hopelessness that comes out of the complexity of the world. Second tip, there's some great thinkers out there in this field. If you have a chance, I'll recommend 2 books to you, The Fifth Discipline by Peter Senge and Thinking in Systems by Donella Meadows. They also have articles published and websites. You can find a lot that these people have done. Becoming familiar with their thinking on the topic is very helpful in saying how do we understand whatever system it is that we're focused on and working on. Third tip, systems thinking, it's not an easy fix. Paul Anderson, he had a great quote. He said, "I've yet to see any problem, however complicated, which when looked at in the right way did not become still more complicated." The systems thinking is not an easy fix, but the fixes it creates can be longer lasting and more effective because they're addressing the roots of situations instead of the symptoms that we often see. Fourth tip, I mentioned the literature in this area was small but growing. What I've found in my own experience is communicating with the authors is a very effective way of learning about the field. You can learn more than what is published in the actual articles they publish. And because it's a relatively young but burgeoning field, the authors are willing to talk and communicate. So communicating with them is very helpful. Fifth, as you become more and more immersed in systems thinking, you'll find that your perspective changes. You'll stop looking for who's to blame and instead start asking, what's the system? Now, for those of us who work in the social determinants of health, This resonates quite deeply. We're not trying to look at individuals, but look at systemic or constructs. What's going on that affects an individual's behavior or experience? I experienced this personally just the other day. I was having a parenting discussion with my wife, talking about the behavior of one of our children, and the comment was the trick is helping them to not think in the present, but to learn to place increased value on the future, especially when there's a delay between the present and the future, the present activity and its result. So in our own way, we were experiencing systems parenting 101. But it changes your perspective as you get into systems thinking. Sixth, systems thinking is about models. And the quote here is from Donella Meadows in the book I referred to. Everything we think we know about the world is a model. Every word in every language is a model. All maps and statistics, books and databases, equations and computer programs are models. So are the ways I picture the world in my head, my mental models. None of these is or ever will be the real world. So even though systems thinking presents itself as a better way of working with the real world, it still depends on models. And models are representations of the real world, but never the real world. And this ties right into the next tip. My model might be different than your model, and your model different from someone else's model, and that's okay. That's how it should be. So what that requires is communication about our models. Exploring models and the assumptions in them requires the application of dialogue as opposed to discussion. And a great definition I've heard of the difference between the two, dialogue is the capacity of people to suspend assumptions and enter into a genuine thinking through. To the Greek, dialogos meant the free flowing of meaning through a group, allowing the group to discover insights not attainable individually. Dialogue differs from the more common discussion, which has as its roots percussion and concussion, literally a heaving of ideas back and forth in a winner-takes-all competition. So picturing those two, dialogue, you may disagree with the models I presented, the models I created. That's great. I can learn from your experience, your assumptions, what you saw in the literature. We can share our models, and by doing so, we improve them. But we do that through a process of dialogue as opposed to discussion, my model versus your model, which one wins kind of experience. Tip number 8. At the heart of systems thinking is a shift of mind from seeing ourselves as separate from the world to connected to the world, from seeing problems as caused by someone or something out there to seeing how our own actions create the problems we experience. You may be familiar with the butterfly. Somebody said a butterfly flaps its wings and then somewhere way far away something huge and dramatic happens. That always used to strike me as odd. I didn't quite understand it. I think perhaps I'm starting to understand it a little bit, just a little bit, the more I immerse myself in systems thinking and trying to understand systems thinking. Tip number 9. Many of the systems that we contemplate or work on are human systems. And the nature of structure in human systems is subtle because we are part of that structure. This means that we often have the power to alter structures within which we are operating. However, more often than not, we do not perceive that power. In fact, we usually don't see the structures at play much at all. Rather, we just find ourselves feeling compelled to act in certain ways. So a key philosophical underpinning of systems thinking is that structure determines behavior, which again resonates nicely with public health's emphasis on society and social structures. So if you find yourself or others compelled to act in certain ways, this is just the way it works or the way it happens, you're operating within a system that structures that behavior. It could be a culture, it could be an organization, whatever it could be. 10th tip. If you're interested in systems thinking, like I said at the beginning, I'm very interested in systems thinking. I'm constantly challenged by how much I don't know about this topic. There's some great organizations out there that you can join, participate in, and it can help you in your learning. 2 I'll mention. One, the Society for Organizational Learning. This was founded by Peter Senge years and years ago. And they have different conferences, events, tools, resources that they provide to their members to help them as they learn and explore systems thinking and its application in different ways. Another is the System Dynamics Society. This is a group of people who work really on the modeling part of systems thinking. And they have a Canadian chapter, again, for those working and learning about systems thinking. They also have a health chapter that isn't Canadian-based, but general, across countries for those who work in health. Those are 10 tips. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, systems thinking, it's deep, and it deserves much more attention than what we're able to give it in a 1-hour webinar. But I hope you found this introduction to systems thinking interesting, that you're familiar with the components of systems, how they work together. You've seen some examples of systems thinking, and hopefully it's triggered in your own mind opportunities to explore systems thinking in the issues, populations, and organizations, where you do your work. Normally we have time for question and answers, but I see our time is almost up. It's 9:57 Mountain Time, 11:57 Eastern Time. So rather than hold you longer than the 1 hour which we design these webinars to fit, if you do have questions, I'll share my email address, and I'd love to have those question conversations by email after the meeting. So we'll skip the question and answer. So thank you for your participation today. Today's webinar was recorded, as I mentioned at the beginning, and we should have it up on our website in the next day or two, so you can revisit the things and ideas that we shared today. And we would appreciate your feedback on today's webinar. I do have an online evaluation. It's a brief survey that I'll send to you. We'd appreciate you filling that out and sending it back to us. Also, if you found systems thinking interesting, we have at Equiate what we call our 4-hour rule. And you may, if you participate on a webinar before, you're familiar with this. If not, I'll explain it to you. We modeled this after Google, that has their 20% rule, where they give their engineers the autonomy to focus 20% of their time on their own ideas relevant to Google's work. And this created Gmail and other tools that we've become very familiar with and appreciative of. So at Equiate, we've adopted a similar practice. We call it our 4-hour rule. So we dedicate at least 4 hours a week to simply talking with others about the health or social issues that they're working on. Now, given the webinars that we're hosting, we've dedicated this 4-hour rule to our webinars, to follow up on our webinars. So what this means is, if you found systems thinking interesting or puzzling, either way, but would like to discuss it in more depth or in more detail, or its specific application to your work, if you'd like to explore that and talk that through, we're available to have those conversations with you. Simply send us an email. My email address is on the screen, and we'd be happy to chat about this with you and apply it to your situation, to your work, and see how it could be applied or be a benefit in that context. It's absolutely free. It's just part of our own culture that we create at Equiate. We value working with others. Our whole purpose is to support those who are working to address health and social problems. So thank you again for your participation today, and I look forward to future conversations with you about systems thinking, and to seeing you in one of our other webinars about working to solve social problems. Again, my name is Steve Peterson with Equiate. I'm signing off for today. Thank you.